And welcome back to another video. My name is Daniel Rogers. You're on my YouTube channel. You clicked on it. And this is the second video in a series on the eschatology of Paul in 2 Corinthians chapter 3. The premise of this series is that Paul in 2 Corinthians 3 lays out what we're going to call covenant eschatology. This is a phrase that is used and misused by many, so allow me to clearly define it here at the very beginning. I believe that Israel serves as a microcosm for all of humanity. Israel is the particular, humanity is the universal, and in order to demonstrate the condition of the universal, in order to demonstrate the struggle of humanity, all of humanity, Israel was given a covenant, Israel was given a temple, Israel was given laws and commandments to follow to show humanity's condition so that the need and gift of a savior could be more appreciated, not just for Israel only, but for the whole world. And 2 Corinthians 3 gives a good outline of that. And so I thought it would be good to discuss covenant eschatology in the context of 2 Corinthians 3. Just to further define it ever so briefly, a covenant refers to the old covenant and the new covenant, and eschatology refers to the study of the end, meaning that eschatology concerns itself with a transition of the covenants, which is a microcosm of God's solution for the human condition and the delusion introduced into the world in Genesis chapter 3 via the serpent. Thank you very much. Okay, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, and we're going to be looking at now verse 4. Specifically, verses 4 through 6. Again, I'm going to read this in the New Revised Standard Version, in the New American Standard Version, and then in the Second Testament translation by Scott McKnight. Let's begin. Such is the confidence that we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are qualified of ourselves to claim anything is coming from us. Our qualification is from God, who has made us qualified to be ministers of a new covenant, not of letter, but of spirit. For the letter kills, but the spirit gives life. Now, New American Standard. Such confidence we have through Christ toward God. Not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who also made us adequate as servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And now, Scott McKnight's The Second Testament. This is a great book, by the way. If you don't have it, you should get it. It's also available electronically, but what's the fun in that? Okay, verses 4 through 6. We have such a persuasion with God through Christos. We are not adequate from ourselves to calculate something as from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God, who made us adequate as the new covenant's servants, not of letter, but of spirit. For the letter kills, but the spirit makes life. All right, very good. So he has confidence. He has been persuaded. And in this other passage, he has confidence through Christ towards God. Notice that the confidence that Paul has is through Christ. That's important. The confidence isn't through the ministry of death or through the letter or through the tablets of stone or through the covenant given to Moses. The confidence is ultimately through Christ. We're going to see why as we move through the text. But I think what's important for us in this particular passage in terms of modern day application is that our confidence should come through Christ toward God as well. That is, whenever we're out and about living life, doing what humans do, making mistakes, getting back up again, trying to better ourselves, trying to better those around us, trying to be productive members in our congregation or of our family, or of our jobs or of our society. We are living not through ourselves towards God, but through Christ towards God, which means that our failings are ways of bettering ourselves, of maturing. Our times of struggle could be seen more clearly as times of crucifixion that lead to resurrection, to use some imagery from the book of Philippians chapter 3. Our life is oriented towards God, but it's oriented towards God through Christ, because Jesus has perfectly revealed who the Father is through Jesus' own life, ministry, teaching, death. If you want to learn more about that, I encourage you to look at my series on the eschatology of John available on my Substack, danielcrogers.substack.com, for free, or you can listen to the voiceovers right here on my YouTube channel. There's a playlist available on my YouTube channel for the Eschatology of John. So our confidence is toward God, but it's through Christ. Christ is the mediator. Then verse 5 says, not that we are adequate in ourselves to consider anything as coming from ourselves, but our adequacy is from God. 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 5 in the New Revised Standard says, not that we are qualified of ourselves to claim anything is coming from us. Our qualification is from God. So the ideas of qualification and adequacy are things that Christians struggle with a lot. We talked about imposter syndrome in one interview that I had with a pastor from Maine a week ago or so. And one of the things that we struggle with is saying things like, I'm not worthy of God's love. I'm not worthy of God's grace. Who am I that God should care for me? Who am I that the highest king would ransom me? We ask these questions a lot, and we ask them in our songs and in our poetry and our writings. But the answer to all those questions is your ideas of qualification and worthiness don't matter because God loves you. And sorry, buddy, but there's nothing you can do about that. God just loves you. And that's what he's saying. Our adequacy comes from God, not from ourselves. When we start asking those questions like, are we worthy? Are we good enough? Are we loved? We're allowing that old delusion to come back in, that original lie that the serpent said rather in the book of Genesis chapter 3, when he was asking Eve whether or not she could eat of that fruit. Got to expel those ideas from our thoughts and our minds and understand that our qualification as God's children, our adequacy in this life as ministers, as priests in God's kingdom, comes from God. All right? Because we're looking at God through Jesus. We used to think that God was like that, but now we don't, because now we see God clearly through Jesus. Verse 6 says that he has made us qualified, or he's made us adequate servants of a new covenant. Now, this is where we have our particular reference back to Jeremiah chapter 31 and verse 31. Again, this is brilliant. This also comes from Jesus' sayings, Eucharistic sayings before the cross, when he sat down with his disciples at the Last Supper and he says, this is my blood of the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. So the new covenant is present. It is not a future reality that's going to come sometime later on after all this mess with Israel and Palestine is resolved or whatever. All right. The new covenant is a present reality. And Paul was a minister of the new covenant. And the Hebrews writer affirmed the idea that the new covenant was a present reality. And you and I are ministers of the new covenant today because we're citizens within this new covenant community. The new covenant is not going to come to the end after a secret grace dispensation or mystery dispensation, and the books of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude and Revelation are not written to a future Jewish audience. They were written to a present Jewish audience living at the time of those writers 2,000 years ago. And the new covenant is a present reality, and we ought to embrace that idea because it is awesome at the blessings that we have access to now in our lives. All right. Now, he says ministers of a new covenant, and then he equates that with the Spirit, and then he equates that with life. So notice the three things that are correlated here. He says we are made adequate as servants of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. New covenant, Spirit, and life go hand in hand. When the Apostle Peter stood up on the day of Pentecost in Acts chapter 2 and says, this is that which was spoken of by the prophet Joel. In the last days, I'll pour out my Spirit upon all flesh. He didn't just have Joel in mind. Ezekiel chapter 36, Ezekiel chapter 37 also foretold a time when God would put his Spirit within the people and cause them to come up out of their graves, is what Ezekiel 37, 11 through 14 says. And that would be a time when God would make a new covenant with the house of Israel. And through, by the way, the son of David, as per Ezekiel 36 and 37. And so when Paul says a new covenant, this is loaded with history. Everybody knows that Paul is talking about the restoration of Israel. Everybody knows that Paul is affirming that King David is once again sitting on his throne through Jesus. Everybody knows that he is saying that resurrection life is here. Because the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. And as Jesus taught throughout the Gospel of John, okay, that the Spirit is the water of life that is refreshing, that gives us new life, and that gives us a new way of viewing the world and a new way of viewing God. Now, if there's a new covenant, that means there's also an old covenant, right? If somebody says, I got you a new pair of shoes, that means you have an old pair of shoes. So what old covenant is under consideration here? Well, it's the covenant that's related to Moses, as he's going to reveal on in verse 7 and following. But there's already some things said in this context that would lead us to believe that the Apostle Paul is talking about the old covenant. For one, he talks about in chapter 3 and verse 3, that it was chiseled on stones. If anybody that has ever been close to the Bible at all understands that Moses had stone tablets, and etched upon them were the 10 commandments, which were a summation of the old law. All right? And so he says that we're servants of a new covenant, not of the old covenant, not of the letter, right? Not letters chiseled onto a stone or even written on a page, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. The letter kills. Now, first off, we have to make it very clear, very plain here that the old covenant was holy and just and good, as the Apostle Paul said in Romans chapter 7. Not only that, we might even quote the Psalms and say that the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul. All right? It's not that we have, or that Paul has, a low view of the old covenant. He just has a super, super, super high view of Jesus. Okay? A super, super, super high view of the Christ. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit just to read you this one passage. Okay? Verse 9, if the ministry of condemnation has glory, much more does the ministry of righteousness abound in glory. So it's not that he's saying that the law was bad or the law didn't have a purpose or that the law wasn't from God or anything like that. He says, no, the law had glory. It's just the glory of Jesus it blinded me on the road to Damascus. How could that never happen when I was sitting in synagogue, right? Or worshiping in the temple. So it's not that he has a low view of the law. It's that he has that much higher of a view of Jesus, okay? So he says that the old covenant, which he equates to the letter, kills, whereas the new covenant, which relates to the Spirit, gives life. So letter isn't the idea that the letter kills is an interesting idea, and I think that we need to talk about why. It's very simple. In Genesis chapter 3, when Adam and Eve were in the garden, the serpent comes to Eve and he says, hey, Eve, you can eat of any tree, right? And Eve says, well, I can eat of every tree but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. God has said, if you eat that, or even if you touch it, you're going to die. And the serpent says, you will not surely die. They reach out, they take of the fruit, and we all knows what happens next. Adam and Eve leave the garden. God places a cherubim with a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life, and they're now exiled. Well, the Garden of Eden was set up using temple imagery. All right, it's orientation where they would enter into the east to go in to the garden. Deeper into the garden would be traveling westward. Was written to remind us, or perhaps the temple was created to remind us of the garden imagery in Genesis chapter 2 and 3. And so when we think about Israel's journey in history, we often see that journeying eastward, okay, was taking them away from the promised land. Journeying westward was them coming home. As we read about Cain in Genesis chapter 4, as we read about the people following the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11, we read of an eastward movement. Even in exile, Judah was taken eastward, right, to Babylon. And so in the book of Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham is called home, he's called to go to this land that he would be shown that would be his home forever and ever and ever. He was told to travel westward. So he's going west is going back home. Going east is going further into death, further into separation. The temple itself and the tabernacle were oriented in this way as well. You come in from the east and you go into the west, and the further west you go, the further you go to the most holy place, the further you go to the presence of God. One problem, though, and that problem is you can't go in there, because if you're watching this, most likely you're a Gentile. And if you're watching this, most likely you're not of the tribe of Levi. And if you're watching this, you're most likely not part of Aaron's direct lineage. And so most likely you're not eligible to go into the most holy place. Sorry to break it to you. All right. So imagine this. You have 3 pilgrimages a year that you're to take to go and to worship God in Jerusalem. The temple's been established. It's been built. It's beautiful. Solomon put a whole bunch of money into building this thing, and you're traveling there 3 times a year to go worship God. Well, even though you've traveled hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles, maybe thousands of miles, there is only so close you can get to God's presence. All right? The women could only go so far. Gentiles could only go so far. Eunuchs could only go so far. Men of the house of Israel, you can go a little bit further, okay? Priests and Levites, okay, you can get into the holy place. But the most holy place, 1 time, once a year, 1 man. Technically, 2 times, once a year, 1 man. Because he had to go in twice, once for himself and once for the people. What is this showing? This is showing us, it's a visual picture of man's torn relationship with God because of his own delusion. He can't go into the garden. He can't go into the presence of God. And this is personified, is that the right word? Through the temple. Or how about this? Sacrifice. You can bring sacrifice over and over and over and over and over again. But guess what? It's never going to take away sin. There's going to be a remembrance of sin year by year by year, as the Hebrews writer says in Hebrews chapter 9, as well as in Hebrews chapter 10. Let me show you another idea here. This is Romans chapter 7. All right. The Apostle Paul is reflecting upon his own life here. And I'm already 16 minutes in. Man, this is a fun series. And he says, what are we then to say? That the law is sin? By no means. Okay. Yet if it had not been for the law, I would not have known sin. I would not have known that it is to covet. If the law had not said, you shall not covet. But sin, seizing an opportunity through the commandment, produced in me all kinds of covetousness. For apart from the law, sin lies dead. I was once alive apart from the law, and when the commandment came, sin revived, and I died. The letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. So there had to be a change. There had to be a transition from the old covenant to the new covenant, from death to life. And we're going to talk about that more in the next video. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and God bless.